Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Independent Thought. My name is Desmond Price. For today's episode, we are joined by Drew Turner. Drew, thanks for coming back on the show today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Desmond. Thanks for having me back on.
Absolutely. Drew came on the show last year to talk about the Boy Scouts of America. For those of you who did not see or listen to that episode, please go ahead and check that out. That's another important conversation that he and I have had in the past. But for today's conversation, we are focusing on the PACT Act and specifically the burn pits that were taking place over in Iraq and in other places overseas. So thank you again for coming on the show to talk to me about this today. I kind of wanted to give everyone a brief rundown of what the PACT Act was. We're going to talk about why it was so important later in the episode, but just for an introductory sake, what exactly was the PACT Act that was just passed in the Senate about like 2 months ago?
So, one of the big issues surrounding burn pit healthcare was a lot of veterans didn't have any right to it. There are some of us, that our disabilities happened while we were in service, so we were already covered under and designated as covered by the Veterans Administration, or more specifically, the Veterans Health Administration, the VHA. But for many, especially those that got out later and let's say developed some type of rare cancer or other disabilities later, it was hard for them to prove that this was tied to their military service. And so for many, in fact, many even died without getting proper health care that they should have been entitled to, but because there was no easy way to connect what happened to the burn pits exactly, the VA and government view was to just assume it didn't connect it.
Okay. And, just for a little more personal information for those who might not be aware of like you specifically, how long were you deployed overseas and what was, your exposure to the burn pits themselves?
On that deployment, like my time in service was just short of 10 years. Of that time, almost 7 of that I was deployed outside the US. But the specific deployment where I did have burn pit exposure was about 10 and a half months. And my unit technically was deployed to Kuwait, but then we had teams deployed to spots in Iraq, to include the Iraq oil platforms, working with the Iraqi Marines out there. We had personnel in Kuwait, in Jordan, in Qatar, in the UAE. We had people spread all over, including Djibouti, to Camp Lemonnier. And funny thing is, there was burn pits in most of those locations.
Oh, wow. Okay. So I guess the next most like pertinent question to ask is what exactly was being burned in these burn pits and why were they being burned? And I guess finally to come about that is, were any protections just given to people who were around these pits?
Let me start with a quote. General Smedley Butler made a quote many years ago: "War is a racket." War on the American side of things is typically something that the military industrial complex profits from.
Yeah.
The more they can profit, the better it is. When it comes to burn pits, this was something that basically was contracted out to KBR and several other military industrial corporations. And they basically burned anything and everything that they could instead of returning it to the US because it was cheaper to just burn it there. That meant computer systems and all the plastics and all that type of thing, body parts and other biological hazards from hospitals, in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places. If they had to do like an amputation or something, they weren't going to save that, so it was going to get burned somewhere along the way.
Yeah.
But just a little bit of anything and everything. I heard stories that there was even vehicles pushed into the burn pits at times. I can't confirm that. I don't know. I didn't see that, but there was a lot of things thrown in there, most of them dumping toxins pretty much across the bases.
And did you have any idea how dangerous it was when you were around it? Like, did anyone give you kind of like any indication that, hey, this might be dangerous, or hey, you might want to put some protection, like, like masks on, or stand so
No.
far away from the pits, like what, anything like that at all?
I hate to say it because it should have been common sense. It should have been, those of us, and my understanding is there were some people that did raise an alarm over it at times, but they both mostly just got, hushed up for stuff. It wasn't until I want to say Kelly Kennedy, who's with Warhorse News, kind of raised a report around 2008, 2009, something like that, where it started to get taken a little more seriously. But for the most part, most of us just didn't think too, you didn't think too much about it. You just kind of accepted that it was par for the course, not realizing exactly what was happening.
Did you ever feel uncomfortable, like in any sort of like way? Like when you were being asked to throw things in there, like did
Well,
it actually like phase you at all?
I wasn't part of any kind of burn pit details. Basically my exposure was being near them, or basically the smoke coming across the base. But we did walk over a couple of times and watch what was being thrown in. That's why I know about the computers, because I
Right.
watched them throw in a bunch of computer towers and was just amazed that I was like, why aren't we just giving these to the locals or somebody that can get some use out of them, or let them,
Right.
part them out and take the hard drives and stuff that might be sensitive out of them and let them part them out and sell the pieces or whatever. But I was just sort of amazed what they were doing. But I didn't start to really kind of have any kind of issues until I started to have sinus problems a few months into the deployment, and then wound up getting diagnosed with chronic sinusitis several years later, and that was the beginning of the medical problems I had from the burn pits.
To your knowledge, are these burn pits still active overseas?
I'm told no. I don't think that there's any um, military industrial complex, companies like KBR or Halliburton or any of them that are actively involved. But I'd be incredibly surprised if anybody claimed that there's not open burn pits at some smaller areas, in some locales, where we may take up space on a foreign base or something, like let's say southern Philippines. Well, we have personnel there. That's not our base though, and it wouldn't surprise me if there wasn't still uh, you know open fire burning at all there or many other places.
So one more thing I want to ask you before we take a quick break in this episode. The
Sure.
federal government kind of drug their feet addressing this. We all saw kind of like the display that was made by, Jon Stewart and others, like earlier in the summer, calling out Senate Republicans, Ted Cruz, so on and so forth. But that wasn't the first attempt at trying to get something like this passed for veterans. It seems as though this has been going on for even decades now, if you want to link Agent Orange into this. Are you surprised as a veteran that the federal government took this long to address this issue?
Surprise? No, not really. I mean, it's that quote I gave you kind of sums it all up. War is a racket. Anything they have to do benefits wise, the money's got to come from somewhere,
Yeah.
and then they've got to explain to somebody, because somebody's going to be upset about it regardless, because somebody else isn't going to get a benefit. I'm not surprised at anything the federal government does at this point.
That's fair. And I think when we come back from this break, we're going to talk about exactly how burn pit exposure has affected you directly and how it's affected others. So please stay tuned. We'll be right back after a quick break. Welcome back from the break, everyone. Thank you for sticking with us through this episode of Independent Thought. So before we went on the break, I had mentioned that we wanted to kind of address how this was specifically affecting you. Could you just tell me what are some of the conditions that you have experienced as a result to your exposure to the burn pits?
Well, I mentioned, I was diagnosed with chronic sinusitis a couple years after that deployment.
Yeah.
Let's see. Then in 2000, and I've had kind of all kinds of weird problems, like respiratory colds. I'd become very susceptible to colds, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But in 2013, I developed some type of a movement disorder. It turns out it's an incredibly rare movement disorder that I shouldn't have, because typically it's people that are genetically disposed to it, and we don't have anybody in our family with this. So that was kind of strange. And I'm still kind of dealing with that to this day because it's very medication resistant. So that causes problems. And then in 2017, I was diagnosed with paranasal squamous cell carcinoma, which is basically tumors in my sinuses. And so I had to go through chemo for a couple of years for that. Luckily, it looks like I'm in remission. And so hopefully I won't have to go through chemo again.
Right. So how long in particular have you been experiencing like these like health related issues due to the burn pits? And do you think that you'll ever recover from these issues?
I mean, at this point, it's definitely been over 10 years, probably closer to 12, maybe even 13 years. I've been dealing with things that are connected to the burn pit exposure. Do I think I'm ever going to get over them? No, I think there's always going to be some lingering issues. My sinuses are pretty damaged. And my docs are pretty convinced that that's got to be from whatever I was exposed to.
Did they know right away, or was there any kind of like gap in between like them just like giving you the diagnosis and then like taking some time to kind of connect the two together, or was it more of an immediate thing?
When I was first diagnosed with the chronic sinusitis, there wasn't that connection. That I think at that point it was still kind of them trying to figure it all out. Like the burn pit registry came about right around that same time when they first started really tracking people with burn pit exposure, and there's still I'd say the vast majority that were exposed to burn pits aren't in the burn pit registry and aren't having their health tracked to where we can get a better understanding of what's happening with a lot of people. But
Right.
no, right at first, my doctors at Walter Reed had that just wasn't even a thought.
Right. So let's go on to, I guess, talking about what we had mentioned in the beginning of the episode, which was the importance of the PACT Act. So we mentioned about what it was, but why was this so important for so many people, yourself included? Like, what does this act do for those who were affected by the burn pits?
I mean, for me personally, this does very little. It was important because I know what it's like to have to go through all of that health issue directly related to the burn pits. And so for me personally, it just really, really bothered me that there was brothers and sisters of mine that, that I'd served with that did not have the same coverage that I had with healthcare. And that was a problem for me. I didn't see that as right or fair.
Yeah.
But for many, like, that don't have that coverage, it could be a death sentence. They could wind up with cancer, not have the insurance to be able to get proper treatment. And without the VA backing them up, what do you do? And I couldn't imagine some of these people with the more rare, disorders and diseases, like my movement disorder. I'm lucky I had VA care and Department of Defense care and doctors that kind of could figure it out, because had I been out in the civilian world, I don't know if they would have been able to link any of this or be able to treat it properly. I just don't know.
Medical uncertainty is something that is, I mean, besides the physical toll it takes on you, it is a mental just like wedge in your mind that it just can drive people to the brink. You had mentioned to me that while you were going through your health issues that you had contemplated, taking your life. Would you be willing to share with us exactly what that was like and kind of like how it's so important for these people to have this coverage?
Right. In 2019, I'd been going through chemo for, a couple of years at that point. I was just coming close to finishing my second round of chemo. And life was just falling apart. I mean, it was, I was dealing with a lot of mental health issues, many of them directly related to my physical health, obviously. Life just started kind of collapsing around me, and I didn't know how to talk to anybody about it. I didn't know how to explain it to my wife. I didn't, and she's always been my rock. She's always been there for me, and I just didn't know how to go about it. And at that point, I had some pretty dark days, and it got to a point where I was so upset with everything that, at the time we were living in DC. I lived a couple of miles from Capitol Hill, just outside of DC, across the Maryland line. And I had every intention to take a gun from my safe, get on the train, go down to Capitol Hill, walk up the steps on Capitol Hill and shoot myself on the steps of Capitol Hill, hoping that anybody might just say, well, why did he do it? Because I knew that without some grand thing, and this is where my mind was at the time. I think it was, it was just really wrongheadedness on my part. But at the time, my thought process was, if I do this, maybe it'll help someone else. Maybe somebody else will hear what's happening. Luckily, I had a moment of clarity, contacted the suicide hotline. They got help out to me within minutes. I spent about a week inside the VA mental health care wing. And not to say things were better, but at least it gave me some time, to really get some clarity and get the help I needed.
I'm glad you got the help that you needed. I'm glad
Thank
that you're
you.
still here. And thank you for taking the time to share all of that with us. I know that it's difficult to talk about these issues. And it's one story, but I'm sure that plenty of other people have similar stories to yours about where you just feel helpless when you feel like you have no way out and your health issues are dominating your life. I know people who in my own life have had similar kind of like thoughts while going through their own health problems. So the PACT Act being passed was a monumental thing for so many people. But, when we were hearing about it on the news, a lot of things that we just heard about was just about, Jon Stewart and him kind of like trolling Senate Republicans and so on and so forth. But what were some of the other people who were involved in making this happen that you wanted to highlight?
I think the linchpins was the Torres family. They are the ones that they started an organization called Burn Pits 360. It's a 501c3 nonprofit.
Yeah.
They're out of Texas. Leroy had, a pretty big struggle with his burn pit exposure and healthcare issues, and at one point, I think lost his job due to healthcare issues. But they started this organization, and they've really been one of the big linchpins. And so this can't really be said without them. But also Susan Zier was a huge proponent. Her son-in-law, the PACT Act is actually named for. And she was there with the Torreses constantly. I was already gone from DC, but I remember meeting them several years ago when they first started, because again, this PACT Act wasn't recent. They've been working on this for years. They've been on Capitol Hill, flying in and out of DC. And back when I was living in DC, I did do some stuff up on Capitol Hill, meeting with congressional members on unrelated stuff to this. But in passing, I do remember meeting them at some point along the way, and I really wished I could have done more with them. Along the way, I just was kind of stuck in my own mindset of things. But again, Susan Zier, obviously Jon Stewart and John Feel were, they were the noisemakers. They were the ones that really raised the level up. Tom Porter and the folks at IAVA, Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, Tim Jensen from Grunt Style, it's a military clothing line, but was a huge part of things. There's just so many folks that did so much. I don't know that you could even name them all, but those were some of probably the most important people in this movement.
I appreciate that. I appreciate you telling us more about that, because again, we only got I think a brief slice of the picture when we were seeing all this play out over the summer. So as a final thing I wanted to bring up, like obviously the PACT Act has been passed, and you would think that'd be a nice way to cap off this story, but there is one caveat here, because there was still some sets of egregiousness that you had informed me of that still has not been addressed, that the Supreme Court has actually been blocked anyone from suing the people who are actually filling the burn pits. Can you just go into that a little bit as we wrap up this episode?
So at one point there was some lawsuits going directly after, I think it was KBR, but I may be not. I'm pretty sure it was KBR was at least one of the parties to the lawsuit. And somewhere along the way, the Supreme Court basically said that they were absolved because they were just doing what the government had kind of put them in place for in the contracts that they had. They didn't do anything outside of their contracts. So any harms that came from it just couldn't be. It's kind of like you can't, a military member can't directly sue the federal government due to injuries. It's just kind of one of those weird little things that to keep people from suing the government, even though the government is harming these people.
It's unbelievable. Honestly, like I have my own thoughts about the Supreme Court. We'll save that for another day. But Drew, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Is there any links that you want to just address for people who might be interested in learning more about this situation as we kind of bring this to a close?
Definitely the primary one would be look up burnpits360.org, burnpits360.org. And you can also find them on Twitter, burnpits360. If anybody needs information or may have been exposed in their time in service, those are the folks that they need to get in contact with. And they're the ones that really are in charge of the fight.
All right. Well, thank you so much again for coming on the show today. For everyone who's interested, that link will be in the episode description. Thank you to all the listeners for checking out this episode of Independent Thought. We will see you in the next episode.